She was not supposed to be at the solstice choosing. The invitation had not been sent to Ashford. No gilded parchment had arrived at the healer's cottage, where Mira had spent the last 23 years learning which roots cured fever and which ones caused it. No royal courier had knocked at the wooden door with its chipped blue paint and the dried lavender wreath that her foster mother replaced every spring. Nothing had come. Nothing was meant to come. She had written to Valdoria because her foster mother was dying. That was the whole of it. No destiny, no grand design. A woman she loved was bleeding from somewhere the healers in Ashford could not locate, and Mira had packed her kit, borrowed a horse from the miller who owed her a favor, and ridden for 3 days through rain that turned the roads to mud and cold that turned her fingers to wood inside her gloves. She had arrived at the capital's eastern gate smelling of horse and wet wool, and the particular kind of desperation that has nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with love. The city guard had not wanted to let her through. She had argued. She had shown them her healer's mark, the small silver crescent tattooed at the base of her left thumb, the mark that technically gave any accredited healer passage through any pack gate during medical urgency. The guard had read the regulation twice, looked at her once, and looked at the mud caking her boots twice more. Then he had let her pass with the expression of a man who suspected he would regret it. She had found the Royal Healers' Hall and spoken to the registrar and been told that the woman she sought, one Lady Thessaly, retired from royal service 12 years prior, now resident at the Silver Wing of the palace's East Quarter, was resting and could not be disturbed until morning. It was evening. Mira had been given a room in the servants' wing. She had been told the solstice choosing was in 3 hours, and the servants were requested to remain in their quarters during the ceremony. She had intended to comply. She had sat on the narrow bed with its scratchy wool blanket, and she had thought about Thessaly dying, and she had thought about all the things she had never said and all the questions she had never asked, and she had put on the one dress she had packed that wasn't covered in mud. A dark green wool that her foster mother always said made her eyes look like spring. And she had walked directly toward the noise. The grand ballroom was blazing, 500 wolves in their finest, the chandeliers throwing light like captive stars across silver gowns and dark suits and the kind of jewelry that costs more than Ashford's entire annual harvest. She had stood at the servants' entrance in her dark green wool and watched the alphas of all 7 packs take their places at the crescent table on the dais, and she had thought, I should leave. She had not left. She did not know why. She had stood in the shadow of the doorway and felt something pulling at the center of her chest. Not pain, not fear, but a kind of vibration, like a string being plucked on an instrument she had not known she carried. It was the strangest sensation she had ever felt. It was not unpleasant. It was simply insistent, as if something was calling to her from across the ballroom floor, and her body had already decided to answer before her mind had voted on the matter. The Alpha King had walked in at the stroke of the solstice bell. She had seen powerful men before. She lived in a healer's world, where the powerful came to her stripped of their armor and their pretense, bleeding and frightened, and reduced to simple creatures who wanted very badly not to die. She was not easily impressed by authority. He had still stopped her breath. He was not the tallest man in the room, though he was tall. He was not the broadest, though he was broad. He wore black where every other alpha wore silver or white, and he moved through the crowd the way a predator moves through a forest, not pushing, not parting, simply occupying space in a way that made everything else rearrange itself around him. His eyes swept the room once, the kind of sweep that missed nothing, and even from the doorway, she felt the weight of them pass across her and then snap back. He had looked directly at her. from across a ballroom of 500 wolves. She had taken a step backward. She had put her spine against the doorframe and told herself she was imagining it. She had told herself the Alpha King of Valdoria did not stop mid-stride to look at a muddy village healer in a servant's doorway. She had told herself the prickling warmth spreading from the center of her chest outward to her fingertips was simply the heat of a room with too many bodies and too many candles and too little air. She had told herself all of this very firmly. His feet had been already moving toward her. "You should not be here." His voice was exactly what she had expected from a man who looked like that. Low, resonant, dropped to a register that bypassed the ears entirely and vibrated somewhere behind the sternum. He had stopped 2 feet from her. 2 feet was close. In a room of 500 wolves, 2 feet was intimate. She could feel the warmth coming off him even at that distance, and the prickling in her chest had become something more insistent, something that pushed at the back of her ribs like a hand trying to get out. "I'm here to see a patient," she said. "This is the solstice choosing. It is not open to servants." "I'm not a servant. I'm a healer." She showed him her left thumb, the silver crescent facing up. "And I did not choose when to arrive in Valdoria. My patient did." His eyes dropped to the mark, back to her face. Something moved in them. Something that had nothing to do with the ceremony and everything to do with whatever was pressing against her ribs from the inside. "Your name," he said. It came out like a command so old and absolute it had forgotten it was a question. "Mira," she said. "Mira of Ashford." He said nothing for a long moment. Around them, the ballroom had gone quiet in a rippling circle, the way water goes quiet when something large rises to the surface. 500 wolves were watching their king stand 2 feet from a village healer in a servant's doorway, and 500 wolves were learning something important about this evening. "Mira of Ashford," he said at last. The way he said it made her want to look away. She did not. "Your Grace," she said, because she was not completely without manners. "I will return to my quarters. I did not intend to intrude on the ceremony." "Stay." One word. The prickling in her chest turned to something blazing. "I beg your pardon?" "Stay where you are." He was looking at her like a man who has found something he had given up looking for and is not yet certain the finding is real. "Do not leave this room." It was the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever said to her. She stood in her dark green wool with her healer's kit slung over one shoulder, and the smell of 3 days' riding still in her hair, and the Alpha King of Valdoria told her not to leave his ballroom, and some part of her body that she had not consulted obeyed him entirely before the rest of her had a chance to object. He turned back to the ceremony. She stayed. It was his beta who came to her first. She had retreated to the edge of the room, pressed against a pillar, watching the choosing proceed with the particular feeling of a person who has wandered into a play midway through and cannot leave because the exits are suddenly, inexplicably, watching her. The ceremony involved 7 chosen candidates from the 7 packs, each presented to the Alpha King by her pack's alpha, each circling the moonstone dais while the room waited to see which one triggered the recognition. None of them did. She could tell. She had no idea how she could tell, but she could. The king stood perfectly still through each presentation, his face utterly closed, and that prickling in her own chest told her the answer. It told her in a language she did not speak, but understood perfectly. The man who came to stand beside her was older. Silver streaked through his dark hair, weathered face with kind eyes that had seen too many things to be fooled by much. He held 2 cups and offered her one without preamble. "You look like you need something warm," he said. "I need someone to explain what's happening," she said, taking the cup because she did. "That will take some time." He was watching the ceremony with the face of a man who had expected this outcome for reasons he was not going to discuss in a crowded ballroom. "Brennan," he said, "first beta to King Aldrich. Mira, healer from Ashford." "I know." He said it quietly, kindly, and with a certainty that made the back of her neck prickle. "Lady Thessaly asked me to watch for you." She looked at him sharply. "Thessaly sent for me because she's dying." "Thessaly sent for you," he said, "because she has been waiting 23 years for this moment, and she was not going to leave the realm without seeing it happen." The ceremony ended without acclaiming. She had never seen a solstice choosing end without acclaiming. She was a village healer who had heard about such things from travelers and old stories, but she understood enough to know this was not how it was supposed to go. 7 presented. None chosen. The ballroom's silence had shifted from ceremonial hush to something with teeth in it. The council members at their crescent table exchanging looks that said nothing good. The pack alphas going rigid with something that wanted to be rage, but was dressed as concern. King Aldrich descended the dais. He walked directly to her. She heard the sound the room made, not gasps, not words, just the collective held breath of 500 wolves watching their king cut through the entire assembled nobility and cross the ballroom floor toward the servants' doorway, where a village healer stood with a cup of something warm. He stopped 2 feet from her again. "We need to speak privately," he said. "I need to speak to Lady Thessaly," she said. "She will wait. She is dying. She will not wait indefinitely." Something flickered in his eyes. Not irritation, she thought. Something more complicated. "Then I will take you to her," he said. "After." She should have refused. She thought about refusing. She was not a councilman's ward or a noblewoman's daughter, or anyone the king of anywhere had any claim on. And the word "after" had been delivered with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had never in his life been told no, and was going to be very interested when it happened. "After what?" she said. "After you tell me your mother's name," he said. Every word in her went still. The room he took her to was small and private. A council antechamber off the main corridor, walls paneled in dark oak, a fire burning low in the grate, 2 chairs that she suspected had never been used for anything as informal as sitting. He stood by the fire. She stood by the door, and she did not close it, and he did not ask her to. "My mother," she said, "was a woman named Caitha. She died when I was born. I was raised by Lady Thessaly's apprentice in Ashford. I don't know what you think you know about my parentage, but your mother's name was not Caitha," he said. He said it without cruelty. He said it the way a healer says this is going to hurt. Not as a threat, but as a truth being offered in advance so the recipient has a moment to brace for it. "Her name," he said, "was Lyra. She was the daughter of Lord Aldrich Vance, of House Vance. She died on the night you were born, in a cottage outside Ashford, and the woman you call your foster mother took you from that cottage and raised you under a false name because 3 separate elders had warned your father, and your father had warned no one." Mira's hands were entirely still. She was a healer. She had learned stillness the way other people learn to walk, early, thoroughly, and out of necessity. But her chest was doing something extraordinary, a burning at the base of her throat and a prickling at the backs of her eyes that she had not felt since she was 7 years old and the miller's dog died. and she had pressed her hands to the wound, and the golden light had come, for the first and only time, unbidden. "What elders?" she said. "3 seers," he said. "The first came to your grandfather's court before your mother's birth. She said a daughter of House Vance would one day be the mate of an Alpha King, and that her power, bound at birth to protect her, would be the thing that either saved the realm or ended it, depending on what he chose to do with the knowledge." "What did he choose?" "He sent your mother away at 16, the king said. "He believed he was protecting her. She was with child. She had bonded privately with a man who died before your birth, and Lady Thessaly, who was then royal healer, helped her disappear." Mira said nothing. The fire crackled. Outside the antechamber, she could hear the distant noise of the choosing guests beginning to depart. The low murmur of 500 wolves processing an evening that had not gone as expected. "The second seer," she said. He looked at her. She saw something shift in his face. Not surprise, she thought, but something close to it. She suspected he was not used to people continuing with their questions when he had given them something large to absorb. "The second came to my father's court," he said, 12 years before you were born. She said the Blackmere line would not end, but that the mate who would carry it forward was not yet born. She said she would come from fallen nobility. She said she would smell of healing and silver light, and she would not come willingly, because she had been taught her whole life that the things she wanted most were the things most likely to destroy her. Mira thought about Thessaly's letters, all of them affectionate, all of them careful, all of them containing nothing of this. "And the third?" she said. He paused. It was the first real pause she had seen from him. Not hesitation, exactly, but the pause of a man choosing where to place the weight of a sentence. "The third came to me," he said, 11 years ago. I was 22. I had been Alpha King for 3 years, and I had spent all of them ignoring every seer my council sent to me. Because seers are very good at telling you things you do not want to hear, and very poor at telling you what to do about them. He looked at the fire. This one was different. She was very old. She came without invitation. She walked into the council chamber while I was in the middle of a treaty discussion, and she sat down at the table, and she waited until everyone else had finished speaking. And then she told me that my mate was alive in Ashford, that she was not yet grown, that she would come to me on the night of a winter solstice when she was 23, and that I would do something unforgivable unless I had already decided not to. Mira waited. "She told me," he said, "that I would look at the bond and I would call it a mistake, because I would have spent 11 years preparing for a ceremony where my mate was supposed to appear, and instead she would appear in a servant's doorway in mud-stained boots and dark green wool, and nothing about it would match what I had imagined, and that I would let my pride make the decision my wolf already knew was made." The fire burned. Outside, the ballroom was quiet now. "Did you?" she said. "Call it a mistake?" He looked at her with gold eyes that held every version of honesty, including the ones that cost something. "I thought it," he said. "When I first saw you at the doorway, the bond activated the moment you stepped into that room. I felt it, and my first thought, before my wolf drowned it out entirely, was, this is not what I planned." He exhaled. "I have spent 11 years planning for a queen, a political mate with bloodlines and alliances and the correct kind of power in the correct kind of container. And instead, the moon sent me a village healer who argued with my guard and is still wearing her riding clothes." Something came up her throat that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She pressed her lips together and kept it in. The seer told me, he said quietly, that if I called it a mistake out loud, the bond would hear me. And a bond that has been called a mistake by the alpha who holds it has a way of becoming exactly that. And if you didn't? She said. She said the bond would be the most powerful the Black Mirror line had carried in 500 years. He turned from the fire and looked at her fully, completely, with none of the careful management she suspected he kept on most of his face most of the time. She said it would outlast everything that tried to break it. She said my mate would walk into danger that would terrify me, and that I would want to stop her, and that I shouldn't, because the only thing that stood between Valdoria and what was coming was the power my mate didn't yet know she had. Mira thought about the golden light at the base of her palms, the light she had spent 23 years not thinking about. "And what is coming?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. But the seers all agreed it was worse than anything that had come before, and all three of them told me the same thing. He crossed the small distance between them, not all of it, not into the 2-foot territory that was already theirs, but close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him again. They told me that whether it arrived in a ballroom or a servant's doorway, the mate the moon made for me would be the finest thing that had ever happened to this kingdom, and that I should not let pride tell me otherwise. The fire popped. The bond hummed between them like something alive. "You should have let your guard give me a copy of those seer reports," she said. "I would have arrived looking more presentable." Something shifted in his face. The smallest thing. The tiniest fraction of a curve at the corner of his mouth, brief as a caught breath and twice as telling. "I am beginning to think," he said quietly, "that you are exactly as you were meant to arrive." She went to Thessaly that night. The old healer was not dying in the way the messenger had implied. She was bedridden, yes, a chest condition that had worsened with the winter cold. Her breathing labored, but her mind fully sharp, her silver hair coiled against the pillow with the particular dignity of a woman who intended to face whatever came to her, with her hair properly done. She looked at Mira for a long moment when she came through the door. "You've already spoken to him," she said. Mira set her kit down and pulled up the chair by the bed. "What did you know?" she said. "And when did you know it?" Thessaly sighed. It was the sigh of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had decided that tonight was the night she put it down. "I was in the council chamber," she said, "when the first seer came. I was 30 years old and newly appointed to the king's medical staff, and I sat in the corner where the physicians sat, and I listened to an old woman tell the court that House Vance's bloodline carried something extraordinary, a healing power that ran deeper than the common strain, deeper than anything the wolves had catalogued, something that reached back through the centuries to an older magic entirely." She paused, gathering breath. No one believed her. Seers were not rare in those days, but seers of that caliber were, and the court had grown comfortable ignoring them. Your grandfather listened and dismissed her in the same sentence and returned to his trade discussions. "But you believed her," Mira said. "I had seen your mother's aura," Thessaly said simply, "when she was brought in for her yearly examinations. Most healers don't look. It requires a particular trained sensitivity. But I had studied under a healer who insisted on it, and your mother's light was unlike anything I had ever documented. It was golden, and it was vast, and it was bound so tightly inside her that she herself had no idea it was there." She looked at Mira. "When she died, and you were born, I held you for the first moment before the midwife took you, and I saw the same light in you, and I made a decision. To hide me," Mira said. "To protect you," Thessaly said. and her voice carried both the certainty and the weight of a woman who knows the difference matters. What your grandfather had done to your mother, sending her away, refusing to acknowledge her, cutting House Vance from the council rolls, that was not protection. That was fear masquerading as strategy. I chose differently. Mira thought about Ashford, the cottage with the chipped blue door, the lavender wreath every spring, the miller's wife who taught her which berries were poison and which healer from 2 villages over could be trusted to supervise her first bone setting. The childhood that had been ordinary in every way except the strange golden warmth that came to her hands when she pressed them to wounds and the binding she could feel around it like a scar she had been born with. "You bound my power," she said. "Your mother did," Thessaly said. In the last hour of her life, she was a powerful healer herself, far more controlled than the court ever suspected. And she spent the last of what she had on a binding that she told me was meant to hold until you found the thing that could anchor your full awakening safely. Her eyes held Mira's steadily. She said you would know when you found it. Mira thought about the prickling in her chest, the blazing when the king had said stay, the bond humming between them in the antechamber like something that had been waiting for this moment since before she was born. She meant the bond, she said. She meant the bond, Thessaly agreed. She had seen her own mate die, and she had felt what that loss did to her power. The way it surged, untethered, looking for the anchor that was gone. She did not want that for you. She bound what she could, and she left instructions that I have been carrying for 23 years. Thessaly's hand found hers on the blanket. Old fingers, healer's fingers, slightly crooked from decades of difficult work. And then she trusted me to raise you in the one place no one would think to look for the future queen of Valdoria. Mira sat with that for a long time. The fire in the grate was lower now, the room holding warmth like a sleeping thing. Outside the palace windows, the winter moon was exactly what the ceremony had been named for. Full and blazing and cold and magnificent, and it was doing something to the bond in her chest that she was going to have to think very carefully about. "He almost called it a mistake," she said. "Of course he did," Thessaly said without judgment. "He is his father's son, and his father was a man who planned everything and forgave nothing that deviated from the plan. Aldrich has spent his entire reign trying to be more than that, and he mostly succeeds." She squeezed Mira's hand. "The fact that he's telling you about the seers, instead of hiding them, tells me he's choosing differently." 3 separate elders, Mira said. 3 different courts, 3 different decades, all saying the same thing. "The moon is not subtle," Thessaly said, with the small, tired smile of a woman who has watched enough miracles to have a working relationship with the impossible. "She simply says the same thing until someone listens." She slept in the palace that night, in the small room in the servants' wing, and she did not argue about it because she was exhausted in a way that reached down to the bone. She dreamed. In the dream, she was standing in a clearing at the center of a forest where every tree was silver. Not painted, not frosted, but actually silver. The bark sheened like polished metal, the leaves catching moonlight and throwing it back in prismatic fragments. She was wearing white, which she never wore, and her hands were glowing. Not the careful, small glow she had spent 23 years suppressing. A vast, quiet, certain radiance, the kind that comes not from effort, but from simply being fully what you are. A wolf came out of the trees. He was the size of a war horse and black as the space between stars, and his eyes were burning gold, and she was not afraid of him. She was not afraid of him in the dream the way she had not been afraid of him in the antechamber, which was the same way she had not been afraid of anything since she was small, because the particular thing that frightened her was not teeth, or power, or the dark, but rather the specific vulnerable moment when hope arrived, and she was not sure whether to trust it. The wolf stopped in front of her. His eyes were level with hers because she was standing on something. A stone, she thought, or a root, or perhaps just the natural elevation of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be for the first time in her life. She put her hand against his muzzle. The binding around her power cracked. Not broke, cracked. A hairline fracture, like ice in the first week of spring. She felt it happen with a sound that was not quite sound, more a vibration that traveled up her arm from the point of contact and spread across her chest and settled into the bond like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for it. She woke up with her palm burning and the room full of the faintest thread of silver light that faded as she watched, leaving only the dark and the sound of the palace sleeping around her, and the bond humming in her chest like something that had decided to stay. 3 days later, Thessaly was breathing easily. Mira had worked the chest infection out of her over 2 long sessions, and the old woman had watched her with bright, satisfied eyes, and said nothing except "there it is" when the golden light came on the second day. More controlled than Mira had ever managed, more steady, as if the crack in the binding had settled something fundamental. "You should stay," Thessaly said on the morning of the 3rd day. "I have patients in Ashford. You have a life to begin in Valdoria." She held up a hand before Mira could object. "Not because of him, not only, because you have spent 23 years being a healer who cannot fully heal. And I would like you to see what you become when you stop holding back." Mira was quiet for a moment. "He told me," she said, "what the 3rd seer said about what's coming." Thessaly's face shifted, not to fear exactly, but to the particular gravity of someone who has known a thing for a long time and has simply been waiting for the moment it becomes someone else's weight to share. "I know," she said. "Do you know what it is?" "I know enough to know," Thessaly said carefully, "that it has been building for 15 years. And I know that whatever it is, the realm's best chance at surviving it is standing in this room asking me questions, and should probably go find the man whose bond she is ignoring and stop pretending that the prickling in her chest is just nerves." Mira looked at her for a long moment. "It's not just nerves," she said. "No," Thessaly agreed. "It is very much not." She found him in the palace gardens. It was evening, and the moonflowers were open. Small white blooms that only unfolded at night, scattered across the garden beds in a way that looked accidental until you noticed the pattern. The way they formed a path through the dark from the garden gate to the old stone circle at the center that the palace historian said had stood before the palace itself. He was standing at the stone circle with his back to her and his hands clasped behind him, and he heard her coming 20 feet out. She knew, because his shoulders changed, something going out of them and something else coming in. "I've decided to stay," she said, "for reasons that are partly professional and partly because Thessaly pointed out that I have been holding back for 23 years, and it is a professional embarrassment." He turned. "And partly," she said, because she was a healer and she had not built her entire practice on lying to patients, and she was not going to start lying to herself, because the bond has been humming since the ballroom, and I have been a healer long enough to know that ignoring a symptom doesn't cure it. He was quiet for a moment. The moonflowers glowed white around them, The moon was 3 days past the solstice full and still enormous, still blazing, still doing things to the bond in her chest that she was learning to simply inhabit rather than analyze. The seer said, he said finally, that you would not come easily. I came, she said. I just took the scenic route. That fractional curve at the corner of his mouth again. Larger this time. Still brief, but she was learning to read him already. The way power restrains itself in a man who has never been permitted to simply want something without that want becoming policy. I should tell you, he said, that I have been dreaming about a clearing with silver trees. Her heart did something extraordinary. The wolf with the gold eyes, she said. His breath came out slowly. And the woman in white, whose hands were glowing. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and is trying to determine if it is safe to put it down. I have been having that dream for 11 years, he said, since the night the third seer left. Every winter solstice, the same clearing, the same light. 11 years of the same dream. 11 years of preparing for a ceremony that should have gone differently and didn't. 11 years of planning for a queen who was supposed to arrive in a gown with the correct lineage in the correct configuration, and instead, mud-stained boots, she said. Dark green wool, he said. A healer's kit. The most extraordinary thing I have ever smelled in my life, he said very quietly, crossing a ballroom floor and then telling my guard she had a rite of passage. The bond pulled, not insistently this time, gently, the way a tide moves, vast and patient and entirely certain of where it is going. She took one step toward him. He did not move. He let her come. She understood that about him already, that he would not push, that whatever restraint he carried was not manipulation but genuine, the particular kind of discipline that belongs to a man who knows how much damage he could do without it and has chosen not to. I need to know one thing, she said. Ask. The thing that's coming, she said. The thing the seers warned about, whatever has been building for 15 years. She looked up at him clearly, directly, without armor. Do you know what it will cost? He held her gaze without flinching. I know it will cost everything I have, he said, and I suspect it will cost you more than that. And you're still here. I have been here for 11 years, he said. I am not going anywhere. She thought about that. She thought about her mother spending the last hour of her life on a binding, and Thessaly spending 23 years on a secret, and 3 separate elders walking into 3 separate courts in 3 separate decades to say the same thing about the same bond, because the moon is not subtle. She simply says the same thing until someone listens. She thought about the crack in the binding, the silver tree clearing, the wolf with gold eyes who had stood perfectly still while she put her hand on his muzzle, not flinching, not pushing, simply present. Then I suppose, she said, you had better tell me everything else they said. He reached out, slowly, carefully, asking in every fraction of the movement, and his hand found hers in the dark between them. The bond surged. Not painfully, not overwhelmingly, but fully, the way a fire takes when the wood is finally dry enough to carry it. She felt her mother's binding crack another degree. She felt the light she had been carrying pressed down and folded under, since she could remember stretch and shift and begin, tentatively, to understand that it was no longer required to be small. There is a great deal to tell, he said. I have time, she said. Thessaly's lungs are clear, and my horse is borrowed, and Ashford is 3 days' ride in the rain. The moon made silver everything it touched. The bond hummed between them, steady and blazing and ancient and entirely, irrevocably theirs. Not a mistake, not a deviation from the plan, but the plan itself, older than either of them, older than the council or the choosing ceremony, or the 11 years of winter solstice dreams. 3 separate elders had known. 2 of them had not been there to see it. But the third, she was fairly certain, had died with a satisfied smile. Thessaly lasted 4 more weeks. She died on a morning in early winter, with the light coming in sideways through the window, and Mira's hands warm on hers, and the gold light moving between them in the particular way it moved when there was nothing left to heal but the goodbye. The old woman looked at her near the end with clear, rested eyes and said, "Now you understand why I kept the secret. Mira had understood for some time. She said so." "Good," Thessaly said. "Then stop being afraid of what you carry. Your mother wasn't. Not at the end." She died with her silver hair still properly coiled against the pillow. Mira sat beside her for a long while afterward. She did not summon anyone. She simply sat and breathed and felt the bond warm and present at the center of her chest, where it had now taken up permanent residence, and she thought about all the women who had carried this lineage forward in secret, each of them protecting the next link in the chain, each of them trusting that the thing they were guarding would know what to do with itself when it arrived. He found her there an hour later, as she had known he would. She had felt him locate her through the bond, felt the shift in his awareness when he understood where she was and what had happened. He came in quietly. He sat in the other chair. He did not say anything for a long time, which was exactly right. "She was my mother," she said at last, "in every way that counts." "I know," he said. "I want her to have a healer's memorial, not a court funeral, something in a garden with green things." "You will have it," he said, without qualification. She looked at him across Thessaly's still form. This man who moved through a world like a controlled predator and commanded single words that shaped rooms, who had been having the same dream for 11 years and had almost said the wrong thing in a ballroom doorway and had chosen, in the precise critical moment, not to. She had been a healer long enough to know that the moments of choosing well were rare and ought to be noted. "The third seer?" she said. "Did she say anything else? Anything you haven't told me yet?" He was quiet for a moment. "She said," he said carefully, "that the realm would face something that could not be won by armies or alliances or any of the things I had spent my reign accumulating." He looked at her. "She said it would be won by a healer who finally stopped being afraid of the size of her own light." Mira thought about the crack in the binding, the expanding edges of something vast, patient, careful, learning what it was. "That's a great deal of pressure," she said. "You have time," he said, and then, with the particular precision of a man who used very few words and meant all of them, "And you are not alone." She was not alone. She had a bond that had been predicted by 3 separate elders and dreamed by a king for 11 winters and protected by an old woman with silver hair and a cracked blue door and lavender in spring. She had a power her mother had trusted her with, bound carefully and now beginning to open, stretching its edges the way a healing wound tests itself, cautiously, curiously, with more confidence with every passing day. She reached across the still space between the chairs and took his hand. The bond blazed. The binding cracked another fraction. Outside the window, a winter moon hung low and enormous and entirely certain of itself, saying the same thing it had been saying for a very long time to anyone who was finally paying attention. "The third came to me," he said. He said it differently than he had said the first two. The first two had been history. Things that had happened to other people in other rooms before either of them existed. The third carried weight he had not yet set down. 11 years ago, he said. I was 22. I had been Alpha King for 3 years, and I had inherited a court that believed seers were decorative, prophecy was politics dressed in mysticism, and any man who took either seriously was a man who could be manipulated by the right woman with the right story delivered at the right moment. He looked at the fire. I had spent 3 years proving I was not that man. I had dismissed 4 seers from council chambers. I had revised the court's official position on prophetic testimony. I had built a reputation for being entirely unmovable by anything that could not be verified, quantified, and recorded in the council ledgers. Mira watched him, and then she walked in, he said. Without invitation, without announcement, the door simply opened during a treaty discussion, Lords Thorne and Vance sitting at the crescent table, 7-pack advisors, 2 senior members of the guard, and she walked to the center of the room and she sat down in the empty chair at the head of the table. My chair, and she waited. What did she look like? Mira said. He considered. It was the first question he had not immediately answered, and she understood that the image was still precise in him. The way certain images stay precise forever, because they arrived at the exact moment when the mind was fully, helplessly open. Old, he said. Beyond old. The kind of age that stops being a number and becomes something else entirely. White hair and eyes the color of river stones, and hands that had more stillness in them than most people carry in their entire bodies. He paused, not a pause she would have named as hesitation, but the pause of a man finding the right word for a true thing. She looked like someone who had been waiting a very long time for a very specific moment and had just arrived at it. And the council, Mira said, went entirely silent. He said, which is not a thing the council does. Lord Thorne opened his mouth twice and closed it twice, which is the only time in 12 years of sitting across from that man that I have ever seen him without a prepared opinion ready to deploy. The fractional curve appeared at his mouth again, brief and genuine. She had that kind of gravity. What did she say? He turned from the fire and looked at her fully. She said, Your mate is alive. She is not yet grown. She lives in a healer's village to the east, and she does not know what she is, and that is exactly as it should be, because the things that grow in secret grow stronger than the things that grow watched. He held her gaze. She said, You will spend the next 11 years preparing for her arrival, and you will prepare entirely the wrong things. Because you will imagine a queen, and the moon will send you a healer, and the distance between what you imagined and what arrives will feel, for one single critical moment, like a mistake. Mira's hands were still at her sides. The fire was very low now. Outside, the ballroom had gone fully quiet. She said, he continued quietly, that in that moment I would have a choice. Not a dramatic choice. Not the kind that arrives on a battlefield with everything at stake and the decision obvious in retrospect. A small choice. The kind that happens in the space between a breath and the next one. I could let my pride name what the bond was, or I could let the bond name itself. His eyes did not leave hers. She said the bond would know the difference, and it would remember. That is, Mira said carefully, a great deal to carry for 11 years. It is, he said. And did you prepare the wrong things? He exhaled, not defeat, she thought, but the particular breath of a man who has been holding something in long enough to have developed a complicated relationship with the holding. "I prepared everything," he said. "Alliance maps, bloodline tables, a list of every noble daughter from every pack whose lineage intersected favorably with Blackmere. I redesigned the choosing ceremony 3 times. I commissioned a study of historical mate bond activations to determine what conditions most reliably triggered recognition." He looked at her with gold eyes that held something that was almost amusement at himself. "I spent 11 years being extraordinarily thorough about something the moon had already decided. And when I walked through the servant's doorway, the bond activated," he said. "Before I saw your face. Before I heard you argue with my guard, which I did hear, for the record." The curve at his mouth deepened fractionally. "I was at the far end of the corridor, and you were at the gate, and your voice carried very clearly through stone and distance and approximately 400 years of palace architecture." She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. "The seer said one more thing," he said. "At the end, before she left. She stood up from my chair, and she walked to the door, and she stopped there, and she turned back, and she said, 'The bond you are being given is not the bond you would have chosen. It is the bond that will choose you if you allow it, and it will be the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to this kingdom or to you, but only if you do not make the mistake of calling it a mistake.'" He stopped, and then she left, and the council sat in complete silence for approximately 40 seconds, which is a record that has not since been broken. The fire crackled. The bond between them hummed, not demanding, not urgent, simply present, the way deep water is present, the way the ground is present, the way things are present that have always been there and simply required the right moment to be felt. "She knew," Mira said. 11 years ago. She knew I would come through a servant's doorway in muddy boots." "She knew exactly," he said. "I suspected she had been to you as well, or to someone near you." "She hadn't," Mira said. "But Thessaly knew enough." She looked at the fire. 3 separate elders, 3 courts, 3 decades, all pointing at the same place. "The moon is not subtle," he said. She looked at him sharply. The phrase was so close to what Thessaly would say that it startled a sound from her, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. "Thessaly taught you that?" she said. "Thessaly taught me many things when I was young, and she was royal healer, and I was a boy who asked too many questions during medical examinations," he said. She left the court before I could adequately thank her for most of them. The bond hummed. The binding around her power cracked another fraction, so finely she almost missed it. A hairline seam, a thread of warmth moving from her palms up through her arms and spreading across her chest like the first real breath after a long time in cold water. She thought, "So this is what it feels like when the thing you have been keeping small begins to understand that it does not have to be." She thought, Thessaly knew. She knew this was what the binding was waiting for. She thought, 3 seers, 3 courts. The moon saying the same thing for 23 years. She looked at the man by the fire, this controlled, careful, thoroughly prepared man who had spent 11 years getting ready for the wrong thing and had, in the single critical moment, chosen correctly. And she felt the bond settle into her chest, like something that had finally, after a very long journey, arrived home. "The bond," she said. "Does it feel to you the way it feels to me?" He looked at her, like something that has been waiting, he said, and has stopped. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." She dreamed in silver, It began with the forest, ancient oaks that should have been dark at their roots and rough at their bark, but were instead sheened like polished metal, every surface catching the moonlight and throwing it back in fragments of cold, pure radiance. The ground beneath her feet was silver too, soft and yielding like grass, but luminous, each blade holding its own faint glow, the way snow holds light from a clouded sky. She was wearing white. She never wore white. White was a color for ceremonies and funerals, and women who did not spend their days with their hands in the kind of work that stained things permanently. But in the dream, she wore it without discomfort, which told her something about the dream's logic. It was not operating according to the rules she had spent 23 years learning. Her hands were glowing, not the careful, compressed, apologetic glow she had spent 2 decades suppressing. The small, golden warmth she let herself use only in controlled situations, only when no one was looking, only when the wound was bad enough that she had no other option, and the risk of being seen was lower than the risk of the patient dying. This was nothing like that. This light came from her palms and moved up through her wrists and spread through her arms, and she could feel it all the way to the back of her throat, steady and vast, and entirely without the frantic quality of suppressed things. It was simply there. It was simply her. She stood in the silver clearing and looked at her glowing hands and understood, in the way you understand things in dreams before you understand them in waking, that this was what she was supposed to be. Not someday, not after the binding broke completely, not when she had earned it or trained for it or been given permission. This, right now, in this body, in this moment. The wolf came from between the trees. He moved the way large, powerful things move when they are not hunting. Not stealthy, not slow, but deliberate. Each step placed with the calm certainty of a creature that has no reason to be anything other than exactly what it is. He was enormous. She had heard the stories. Alpha king wolves, the size of war horses, black as midnight. But the stories failed at the part where you stood in front of one and felt the weight of what it meant to be that much power, choosing, voluntarily, to approach you gently. His eyes were burning gold. The same eyes, the antechamber eyes, the ballroom eyes, the gold that held things it did not easily show. She was not afraid of him. This was the truest thing in the dream. She was a woman who had made a careful science of assessing threats since childhood, and she stood in the silver clearing with her hands full of light, and she felt no threat from him whatsoever. What she felt was the bond, blazing between them like a rope pulled taut, like a wire conducting something vast, and the particular quality of his attention, which was the same in wolf form as in man form, which was the quality of something that has found what it was looking for and is being very careful not to startle it. He stopped in front of her. His head was level with her chest. She was standing on something, a root, a stone, the particular elevation that dreams grant when they need you to be at the right height for the right moment. And his eyes were level with hers, and the bond between them had stopped humming and started singing. She lifted her hand. He was perfectly still. Not the stillness of something bracing, but the stillness of something that has decided, with full awareness of the decision, to be vulnerable. She thought of what he had told her about the seer. I could let my pride name what the bond was, or I could let the bond name itself. This was a wolf who had made that choice. Whatever he had spent 11 years preparing had not included this moment, and he was in it anyway. still as starlight, waiting. She pressed her palm to the side of his muzzle. The warmth between them was not the searing heat of first contact that the stories described. The lightning, the fire racing through veins. It was deeper than that. It was the warmth of two temperatures equalizing. Two things that had been running at different registers finally, at the point of contact, finding the same note. She felt it move from her palm, through the bond, and back again, carrying something. Not words, not images, but something older than both. The emotional vocabulary of a creature that had been waiting 11 winters for this exact clearing, this exact light. "I see you," it said, in the language that was not language. "I have always seen you." She felt the binding around her power crack. Not the fine hairline fracture of the antechamber. A full crack, a seam running from the top of the binding to its base, the way ice cracks when the spring finally means it. Not breaking yet, not open yet, but changed, fundamentally and irreversibly changed. No longer a question of whether, but only of when. The light in her hands surged. It did not frighten her. That was the extraordinary thing. The surge that had always frightened her. The overflow she had spent 23 years damming and redirecting and apologizing for came out of her in a wave that lit the silver clearing from edge to edge and turned the trees from silver to gold, and she did not flinch from it. She held it. She was large enough to hold it. The wolf closed his eyes. She stood in the gold-lit clearing with her hand against his muzzle, and her light pouring out of her into the night, and she felt him through the bond. His relief, vast and old, and so long held that he had stopped expecting to put it down. And she thought, this is what 3 seers tried to describe, this exact moment. This is what they walked into 3 courts to say. She woke with the light still fading from her palms. The room was dark. The palace was quiet. Outside, the winter moon had moved across the sky, the careful distance it moved in the hours before dawn, and the bond in her chest was not humming. It was singing, steady and blazing and entirely, permanently hers. Not a symptom, not a disruption, not something to analyze and manage and keep carefully small. Simply the sound of something that had arrived and intended to stay. She lay in the narrow bed in the servant's wing with the rough wool blanket pulled to her chin, and she thought about her mother spending the last hour of her life on a binding, and she thought about what the binding had been protecting. And she thought, she knew. She bound it until I was ready, and she trusted that I would know when ready arrived. The light in her palms faded completely. The bond sang on. She felt it move through her, like the dream had moved through her, like the crack in the binding had moved through her. Not violently, not with the lightning and fire the stories promised, but deeply, the way roots move through earth, the way water finds the level it has always been seeking. The bond surged, and she let it surge. She did not dam it. She did not redirect it. She stood in the palace garden with the moonflowers white around them and the winter moon blazing overhead, and she let the bond be exactly as large as it was. It was very large. She had known it intellectually from the moment it activated in the ballroom doorway. She had felt its edges in the antechamber, in the dream, in the way it had rearranged the atmosphere of every room she had entered since. But this, his hand in hers, the bond running between them like a live current, no suppression on either side. This was something the knowing had not prepared her for. She felt him, not his hand, not his warmth. Him, The 11 years of careful preparation, and the dream that had been the same every winter solstice, and the relief, vast and poorly hidden, that had lived underneath the controlled surface of him since the moment he had seen her in the doorway. She felt the thing he had not said in the antechamber. The part after I thought it that he had abbreviated into silence. The part where his wolf had drowned the pride out so completely and so immediately that the thought had barely finished forming before it was gone. She felt how certain he was. Not arrogantly certain. Not the certainty of a man who expects to be right about everything. The certainty of a man who has been wrong about many things and learned to distinguish between the feeling of being wrong and the feeling of being unquestionably, bedrock, wordlessly right. The binding is cracking, she said. He looked at her. I know, he said. I can feel it through the bond. My mother bound it, she said, until I found something large enough to anchor my full awakening safely. She looked at their joined hands. She trusted that I would know when I found it. And do you? He said. No? She thought about the dream, the gold-lit clearing, the wolf with the closed eyes, the relief that was not hers but had moved through her like her own. I know, she said. The bond blazed between their joined hands. Not a claiming. They were nowhere near the claiming, which required more than a garden and a first night and two people who were still learning the shape of each other's silences. But the bond did not require the claiming to be real. It had been real since before she was born, in the calculations of 3 separate women who walked into 3 separate courts to say the same true thing until someone listened. The seer said my full awakening would be catastrophic without an anchor, she said. She did, he said, not alarmed, simply present. She said the realm's best chance was a healer who stopped being afraid of the size of her own light. Also true, he said. I have been afraid of it, she said, for 23 years. I have kept it so small that I almost forgot what it actually was. She looked at the moon flowers, small and white, and entirely certain of their own blooming. Thessaly said, Stop being afraid of what you carry. Your mother wasn't, not at the end. The winter moon laid silver across everything it touched. The bond between them was the warmest thing in the garden. She died knowing you would be here, Mira said. Doing exactly this. She died, he said quietly, having made sure of it. She thought about all the things that had been arranged, quietly and carefully and over decades, to bring this moment into existence. Her mother's binding, Thessaly's silence. 3 seers walking uninvited into rooms where they were not wanted, delivering the same true thing with the patience of people who understood that the important messages require repetition. She thought about what was coming, the unnamed thing that had been building for 15 years, the thing that could not be won by armies or alliances, or any of the things a king accumulates in the course of becoming very good at being a king. She thought about the light in her palms in the dream, the gold-lit clearing. How large she had been when she stopped being afraid of it. I am going to need time, she said, to let the binding open properly. You cannot rush a wound healing. You can only create the conditions for it and then be patient. I have been patient for 11 years, he said. I am practiced at it. You have also, she said, been driving yourself half to distraction with alliance maps and bloodline tables and a redesigned choosing ceremony, which is not exactly the same thing as patience. The fractional curve appeared again, wider this time, wide enough that she thought with some satisfaction that she was probably one of very few people who had ever seen it get that far. Thoroughness, he said. I prefer the word thoroughness. I'll remember that, she said. The bond hummed between their joined hands. The moonflowers glowed. The binding around her power shifted again. Another fraction, another hairline becoming a seam. The whole careful structure her mother had built beginning its long, intentional, entirely earned dissolution. She was going to be extraordinary. She could feel it the way you feel the first day of spring before it technically arrives. In the quality of the light, in something loosening in the air, in the particular certainty of things that are not yet present, but are undeniably on their way. She was going to be extraordinary, and she was going to do it here, in this kingdom, in this bond, with this man who had spent 11 years being thoroughly wrong about everything except the one thing that mattered. She was right, Mira said. Which one? He said. All three of them, she said. They were all right. He looked at her in the silver garden with the moon blazing overhead and the bond singing between their joined hands, and something moved in his gold eyes that she thought might be the closest he ever came to what other men called wonder. Yes, he said. They were. The moon made silver everything it touched. The bond did not hum anymore. It simply was. As old as the clearing in the dream, as steady as the ancient oaks in the palace garden, as certain as the moonflowers that opened every night without apology and without fear, in full knowledge of exactly what they were. 3 separate elders had known. The moon had said the same thing for 23 years. And now, finally, in a garden in the middle of winter, with the solstice just past and the binding cracking open like ice in spring, someone was listening.